Hello and welcome to Mining Review Africa on the Deep Insights podcast. My name is Hlengiwe Motawung and thank you for joining us and tuning in today. As global temperatures continue to warm, additional sea level rise is inevitable. How much and by when depends mostly on the future rate of greenhouse gas emissions. South Africa has topped the rest of Africa's big carbon emitters with 471.6 million metric tons of carbon emitted in 2019. The country, depending on coal generation for its power, has made commitments to reach net zero emissions by 2050. But is this feasible? So, helping us unpack this very crucial matter is Dr. Crispian Olver. He is the Executive Director for the South African Presidential Climate Commission. Dr. Olver qualified as a medical doctor in South Africa before joining government in 1994. Previously, he held the position of Director General at the Department of Environmental Affairs and Tourism, where he was responsible for developing South Africa's climate policy. He has subsequently worked as a policy expert and author on environmental sustainability and local government issues. Dr. Olver, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Good morning, Hlengiwe, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here, and thank you for that kind introduction.
Awesome. Dr. Olver, before we get into the session, just out of curiosity, when did you realize your interest and passion for the environment? Is it something that's always been there, or was it fueled by the workspaces that you found yourself in? Just take us back to where it all began.
Well, I have always loved nature and the incredible wealth that our natural world brings, to our lives and our enjoyment. So I'm an avid hiker. I'm a cyclist. There's nothing more I love than switching off, getting on my bike and traveling across the landscape. But these landscapes are under threat. So they're incredibly beautiful and valuable, and they give us sustenance as human beings. They produce the clean air that we breathe and the water that we drink and the food that we eat. So we depend on nature, but nature's very fragile. It's under threat. And one of the greatest threats is climate. And you're seeing an exponential increase now in climate impacts. I mean, we're on the early start of this hockey stick curve, and we've seen day zero in Gqeberha, we've seen the KZN floods, we've had periodic long-term droughts and food crises in the country. The bad news is that this is only going to accelerate. We've already warmed by 1.1, 1.2 degrees. South Africa's warming at about double the global average, so we're getting particularly acute impacts. And we know that warming is going to have a devastating effect on agriculture, on rainfall patterns, on extreme weather events, particularly along the coastal regions, rising sea levels. So we have a moral obligation to respond to this. I mean, if humanity doesn't cut emissions, we are going to bequeath a world to our children that they will not be able to live in, and there will be mass migration. In South Africa, we're going to wind back all the development gains that we made since the end of apartheid. We've already got very high poverty, inequality, and unemployment. If we're not proactive, those are going to be accentuated rather than improved. So, that's what drives me. I wake up in the morning and I worry about these things.
So now let's get into the crux of things. Briefly tell us about your role at the Presidential Climate Commission and the Climate Commission's sole mandate.
So we were set up by the president in December 2020. So we're still a young organization. And the basic job is to plan how we get our economy to what we call net zero. So that's a point at which the emissions, the residual emissions, the emissions that we really cannot abate, are being offset by natural sinks and carbon capture and other mechanisms. So net zero, we talk about net zero CO2 emissions. So that's carbon emissions, not all of the emissions. There's also net zero for all the other emissions like methane and sulfur dioxide and nitrous oxide. But let's start with getting to net zero carbon emissions. We've tentatively set a date of 2050, which is what the IPCC, this global collection of the best science and scientific minds in the world. So the IPCC says the world needs to get to net zero by mid-century. And every country is in the process or has already set a net zero target, some later than others. So China said they'll be net zero by 2060. India said they'll be net zero by 2070. There's obviously an obligation on developed countries to lead the transition. So we're expecting them to go net zero in the 2040s. The developing countries will follow later. But this issue of going to, cutting down our emissions, there are also economic interests at play. And what we need to be aware of is that, we've got this electricity system that is driven by coal-fired power generation. It makes our electricity, our power, very emissions intensive. And that emissions intensity then gets translated into the products that we produce. So what we export has these embedded emissions from our electricity system. And over time, as countries cut their emissions, they're going to want to stop what we call carbon leakage. So they don't want to be paying for expensive emission reductions in their country, while other countries are not cutting and they're just importing those emissions in. So many countries are looking at this thing called carbon border tax adjustments, which is a way of compensating, basically stopping carbon leakage. And we stand to be penalized very severely. I mean, a lot of our core exports, our mineral exports, our manufactured products, if we don't start to bring the emissions intensity down now, we're going to find ourselves shut out of global markets in the 2030s and 2040s. So there's some real, there's the imperative to cut emissions in order to stop climate change, but there are also economic interests. And if we are not careful, we're going to find that our manufacturing sector gets liquidated because we're still relying on this very emissions intensive energy system.
Dr. Crispian, South Africa's mining industry employed over 458,000 people in 2021, with slightly over 100,000 in the coal mining sector.
Yeah.
Do you think that this energy transition will maintain or improve these numbers? And what does the job creation within the green economy look like? Just take us through what the Just Transition Framework says about the sustainability of the entire mining value chain.
Yeah. So you're right. I mean, there's about 80,000 people employed directly in coal mining. There's another 10,000 people employed at coal-fired power stations. And then there's a whole ancillary set of jobs and livelihoods linked to value chains supporting that, in including all of the basic services that mining communities need to support themselves. So we're talking about significant job numbers, and those jobs are at risk. There's no doubt about it. We are not completely clear about the timeframes of this transition. We know that many of our coal-fired power stations have reached the end of their lives. We have to be taking them off our grid because they're just breaking down too often and it's too expensive to maintain them. So there is a program for decommissioning power stations, which Eskom has come up with, and which makes logical sense. The obvious criterion for decommissioning is that we need to make sure that we have power to replace it. So we can't decommission into another energy crisis. We've got to ramp up renewables and ramp up battery technology and peaking plant capacity like gas-fired power stations. So you've got to put that in place to enable the decommissioning. So that we've got quite a good handle on. We know what sort of power is needed. We've got various interventions through the REI4P, the other procurement processes that Eskom has launched. So all of this is being brought on and the decommissioning is being planned. What we don't know is how long the global coal market is going to hold up. So, a lot of our coal is exported. Some coal miners supply Eskom exclusively, so they are probably more at risk. But our understanding is that as the global climate impacts accelerate and the world starts to take stronger and stronger action to cut emissions, you're going to see first coal dropping off dramatically, and we reckon that drop is coming in the 2030s. So it's 7-8 years away for a dramatic drop in coal. I mean, coal will still be used into the 2040s and maybe some into the 2050s. We've got to grapple with our big problem is that Medupi and Kusile have only just been built. So logically, we need to run those power stations into the 2050s. And there's some hard calculations about whether we can afford to decommission them earlier. So there's definitely going to be a tail to coal use. It's not going to end tomorrow. But we think the transition's coming a little bit faster than a lot of these coal companies are making out. In fact, some of them, quite frankly, in the way that I talk to them, seem to be in denial about the nature of the transition and the speed with which it's coming. Now, we can debate that. These are market forces. They claim to understand the market better than we do. We can have a debate about it. What we can't not do is we cannot be ill prepared for the transition when it comes. So we're insisting that we start now to put in place the mechanisms to ensure what we refer to as a just transition. And a just transition means people that are most vulnerable in this transition. So the workers in the coal value chain, the communities linked to them, rural communities that rely on subsistence agriculture, poor communities, women and young people, everyone that stands to lose the most in this transition, they should not be the ones bearing the cost. This is a transition that's caused by a set of high polluting, largely northern developed countries, although, industry and coal mining and power generation in South Africa has contributed to the problem. So those industries and countries should be bearing the cost of the transition, not workers on the ground. Now, obviously, the best way to support workers to transition is to be transitioning them into other jobs. and preferably equivalent jobs. Most coal miners don't want to go farming necessarily, or even go and work in renewable energy manufacture. So the best alternative for coal miners is another mining job. And fortunately, the climate transition is not the end of mining. We're going to need considerable minerals for the future green economy. And that includes iron and steel.
Absolutely.
For wind turbines and solar PV infrastructure. It includes the PGM group for the hydrogen economy that's coming. It includes things like lithium, vanadium, which go into batteries, cobalt, rare earths, copper, of course. And South Africa is well endowed with these minerals. I mean, we've got a huge amount of them still in the ground, unexplored. And we've got to work out how we get that mining economy for the future green economy going. And that means we've got to, fix things like fix the cadastral system, which is, year after years of complaining about this mining cadastral system. I mean, DMRE is still not come up with the solution. And I know there's a very active debate going on about whether you should buy an off-the-shelf system or design this thing from spec as a sort of Rolls-Royce new system. You've got to fix the mining permitting process. I mean, the backlog in mining permits at DMRE is completely unacceptable, and it needs focused attention. And we need to sort out some of the sustainability issues around mining. Now, I'm very encouraged by what some of the big mining majors are doing around going to, there was a cell phone. A lot of the mining majors have signed up to net zero targets, and they're doing their operations in a low carbon way. I mean, I was extremely impressed with Anglo's hydrogen powered vehicle at the Mogalakwena mine. That's the way of the future.
Absolutely.
Many of these companies, I mean, NetZero owns a huge renewable company. They've installed vast amounts of solar and wind power generation to drive their mines. So this is the future, and many mining companies are embracing it, and they're doing it, and it's fantastic. It's to be welcomed.
Sorry, Doc, sorry, I need to interject a bit there. You're getting into my future questions.
Okay.
And I need to ask these questions. You sat on a panel at the Coal and Energy Transition Day and stated this, and I quote, "The transition is coming, and we can argue about the pace of it, but it is going to be impossible to have a conversation with the industry if we cannot get past the basic denial around the transition," unquote. So firstly, are coal miners in denial? And what has been the generic response with your interaction with the coal mining sector?
So there's been a long-term, back in the day when I was Director General for the Department of Environmental Affairs and Tourism, organized business, and it wasn't just the mining sector, it was a lot of the high emitters and the high energy users. Basically, they didn't buy into this climate transition stuff that we were talking about. And the strategy that they pursued was obfuscation, delay, putting doubt in the system, questioning the science. That was 20 years ago. I think a lot of people have now woken up to the risks, and they've woken up to the economic risks, and they're working actively with us around how do we navigate this transition? Because, we're not just saying go out and do it on your own. I mean,
Mm.
government needs to stand behind business
Mm.
as it navigates this transition.
Mm.
But a couple of companies are, completely blind to it. And they're continuing to raise completely bogus technologies that are not going to come to the solution. So, there's this fiction that's peddled about clean coal. And the idea behind clean coal is that somehow you can partner it with a carbon capture process
Mm-hmm.
that removes the CO2 emissions.
Do you believe in
Now,
that?
well, the physics don't add up. I mean,
Mm.
the physics of digging coal out the ground,
Mm.
burning it to release energy,
Mm.
and then recapturing those emissions,
Mm.
concentrating them and putting them back in the ground, that, what you gain in energy in the combustion process, you lose in the capture process.
Is
So
it
the physics,
practical though?
it will never, well, let me just say, we will use carbon capture for some really hard to abate sectors at the end of our transition process. There's some emissions that we are really going to struggle to cut.
Capturing.
I mean, not least because, animals and humans burp and fart. It's one of our physical realities, and that produces methane. And methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. And unless you slaughter all your animals, you'll never be able to get rid of it. I mean, you can change their feed, you can reduce the methane emissions by a
But
certain
you will still
percentage.
get it, yeah.
You'll still get some of it. So, and similarly, there's some industrial processes where it's going to be very difficult to find alternative technologies. So carbon capture is going to play a role with those very end of transition, hard to abate sectors, but it's costly. And regardless of the innovation that takes place, it will always remain a fairly costly process. It is not the answer to the coal market. You're not going to continue to burn coal on a mass scale and then capture the emissions in a way that's cost competitive with, say, renewable energy and battery storage, which works as a package for a new low carbon energy system.
So then it's safe to say that this capturing of the emissions within the thermal coal is not so practical at this point in time.
Well, what I object to is the way that carbon capture and storage is used. And you will see in the way, in the conversations where it's introduced, it's basically being introduced to say the coal market is going to hold up forever.
I see.
And that's what I mean by denial. It's not going to happen. The transition is coming. Let's prepare for it. I want to make sure that the workers on the ground and the communities that are going to be affected by this transition are taken care of in the process. We need to start getting ready. We need to carefully look at the mine rehabilitation funds and make sure that they're adequately capitalized. Because, all of this land's got to be restored back to its original agricultural purpose or repurposed for the new green energy economy and the green industries that we can bring in place. So, let's start getting the mechanisms in place. Let's be prepared. We're not going to artificially constrain the coal market. That constraint is going to come because the global market's going to move. It's going to move. And if you're peddling this idea that it's going to hold up forever, you're doing both yourself and the rest of the country a grave disservice.
Dr. Olver, As you've mentioned before, that South African mining companies are slowly jumping onto the green wagon by acquiring renewable assets. We've seen NetZero, as you said, with Synergy, Anglo American with the hydrogen truck, and recently Seriti Resources with Wind Labs Africa and Wind Solar
Yeah, that was
assets.
exciting.
Especially after your standoff at the Energy and Coal Transition Day with the CEO, Mike Decker. This certainly shows a keenness to the transition, but is it enough?
Well, these are very important initial steps. And I mean, I was very interested in Mike Take's subsequent article and their investment decision. And it's certainly the right way to go. And I think it's a very important investment decision. I mean, and there's a tacit recognition there. They're accepting that there is a transition and that there is a risk, and they need to diversify that risk by having a stake in the future new energy economy. Great decision. A lot of coal mining companies are doing that. And I think it's very significant. We're going to obviously have to do a lot more, but
Sure.
the most important thing to do now in the 2020s is lay the foundation for the more aggressive moves that we're going to make in the 2030s. So,
Absolutely.
standing still now is suicidal. You will be eclipsed as a market player if you don't move now. What you've got to do is create the foundation for you to have more options in the 2030s as the real big market shifts start to happen.
And Dr. Olver, I think it's also a very important thing as the Climate Commission to also commend those mining companies that are really trying their best to lay their foundation towards net zero. So it's not all about telling them, we need to get to net zero, but as they come up, as they try introducing renewable assets, I think also it's very important to commend them and say, hey, you're doing well, keep
Completely.
going.
Yeah.
Mm.
No, and don't get me wrong. I mean, I really applaud the kinds of moves that have been made. I mean, I think NetZero's commitment to a net zero target is to be applauded.
Yeah.
I love the work that they've been doing around economic diversification linked to their coal mines. I think it's best practice. It's a way to go. So and all of this is to be encouraged. And we would say, let's just make this standard practice across the industry. So let's set up our just energy transition offices. I mean, some of the leading companies have already set up just transition offices. Let's make sure that ESG is embedded in the way that the board thinks.
And
Let's
it's
have
not just a name, it actually
yeah,
is
not just the
embedded.
name. ESG is about doing business responsibly, and it's core to business, and it's ultimately builds long-term success in the kinds of markets that we're entering into. So make sure you've got a director that understands the ESG game intimately and helps keep raising this consistently at a board level. Let's make sure that we're reporting on climate risks and we're doing our climate disclosures. I mean, there's a whole range of best practice guidelines. The JSE has issued, a really good, solid, easy to implement set of guidelines. All that companies need to do is embrace them. Whether you listed or not, I think every company should be taking up and implementing those guidelines. Yeah.
Absolutely. I agree with you there. So now, Doc, let's talk about taxes. South Africa's low emissions development strategy, as you know, mentions various tax incentives for companies investing in green assets. Can you talk to us a little bit about that and mention some of the requirements for companies to get those tax incentives?
You're talking to the wrong person. I mean, I'll have to wheel in the National Treasury tax people to talk to you about how to tap into the incentives.
But does this help? Does this help coal miners into investing into green assets?
Definitely. I mean, so the conversations we've had with Treasury, and we're largely ad idem about this, is how do you put the economic incentives into the economy so that we can reinforce, the change that is happening, and we can start to properly price the environmental cost of emissions and of practices. So what Treasury is doing is steadily injecting a carbon price into the South African economy. And that's not simply because we want to penalize high emitters, but we're sending a very powerful price signal that you need to systematically start cutting your emissions. And by having an effective carbon price in the economy, you're also able globally, on global markets, to hedge this risk that I was talking about of having our products shut out. So, if our carbon price is equivalent to the carbon price that exists into the country that we're importing into, then we're not liable for the carbon border tax adjustment. So it makes, this is about ensuring the long-term economic competitiveness of our country. It's not about penalizing high emitters. I know that, every time the carbon tax gets wound up and Treasury says that they're going to be removing some of the allowances, there's an outcry from business that, you're taxing us into oblivion and we're going to become uncompetitive. I don't agree. I think carbon pricing is probably the single most effective mechanism we've got for incentivizing the change that's needed.
Let's get a little bit more technical. So the total carbon budget you mentioned at the Coal and Energy Day for South Africa is between 7 and 9 gigatons of CO2. Yeah. What exactly, for a novice like me, does this mean we need to do practically?
So we are working on detailed scenarios around our carbon budget because as the Commission, I spoke earlier about net zero and the date for net zero. I'm actually less focused, I'm less worried about the date at which we get to net zero. The real issue is the area under the curve of our emissions trajectory. So, we're here at, 500 megatons per annum, and we need to get to zero or net zero by 2050. So that's a curve, and the area under that curve is the budget. It's the total carbon budget. So you could get to net zero later, but if you drop earlier on the curve, you can bring your carbon budget down.
I hear
and that's what, ultimately we're worried about, the amount of emissions, of carbon emissions put into the atmosphere. And, there are various calculations that have been made about what is each country's share, what is a fair share of the remaining carbon budget. And the estimates vary quite widely at the moment, but it's in the region of 7 to 9 gigatons of CO2. That's what's estimated to be our fair share budget. I think it's going to be quite hard to get that. And we're doing some scenarios so that we can understand a little bit more carefully what the implications are of different carbon budgets. So, for instance, to get to 7 or 8 gigatons as a carbon budget, we would effectively have to close Sasol in the 2030s. We wouldn't have time for Sasol to make the transition into green hydrogen and to implement their net zero strategy. Now, I don't think that's something we can do. Yeah, I don't think we can hobble. You know, Sasol is our best play at large scale industrial production of green hydrogen. And I think at all costs, we need to make sure that the company survives and is able to get to the point that they need to be. So if you accept that as a starting point, we're probably more looking at the upper end of that budget range. So we're probably more looking at like 9 or 10 gigatons.
Okay.
Is that acceptable in terms of our economic competitiveness and the embedded emissions in our products? That's an economic question that we've got to ask. So we're busy digging into this. I mean, to me, to us, so I'm afraid I'm not bringing you the answer. I'm telling you the internal debate we're having around the carbon budget. You know, there are other issues at stake. So, you know, there's some real practical issues around the pace at which we can decommission coal. And, you know, again, a 7 to 9 gigaton budget would mean that we have to have all coal off by 2040.
It's not practical.
I'm not convinced we can do that. You know, I think we're going to run Medupi and Kusile up into 2050 or a bit beyond. Again, we may not be forced to take that decision now, but we certainly want to create options for ourselves as a country. I mean, the important thing in this transition, there's a lot of uncertainty. You must do the no regret early stage investment that positions you for more aggressive stuff later. So we want to have options available in the transition. But, you know, again, on the coal side, I think we're heading towards the upper end of that budget or overshooting that budget a little bit. Now, you know, the environmentalists are going to, you know, criticize us for this. And there's some people that argue very forcefully that we've got to stick to the fair share budget and that there are very real risks to our export competitiveness. And this is a debate. I mean, what we will present to the public and to the decision makers in government is different options linked to clear quantification of the different budgets. So, you know, let's all debate these things openly and transparently and understand the different trade-offs linked to the decision.
Doc, let's now talk about investments. So Europe's coal burn rate has seen a significant rocket since the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. And this has caused an uncertainty, as you've said, for investors looking into going for renewables. How do you then wall them back in?
Yeah, I mean, the European energy crisis, I think, is very instructive. And it's had an interesting, I mean, it's had two effects. So the one is obviously this return to coal as their gas prices have literally gone through the roof. I mean, it's unbelievable that, you know, like 400% escalation in gas prices. The other thing it's driving, which is going to have long-term benefits on the climate agenda, is it's really accelerated the move into renewables and storage technologies. So there's a little bit of a bifurcated response. You know, people are making a big hullabaloo about how it's a backward step for climate. Well, yes, in the short term, but you're seeing an aggressive scaling up of investment on the renewable side of the equation as well. And I think that's going to stand the world in very good stead going forward. We need to understand this energy transition is not going to be smooth. It's going to be very uneven. And as people start to disinvest in fossil fuels, you're going to find that there's the availability of fossil fuels, the availability of coal and gas and oil becomes increasingly constrained. I mean, we saw that now with the disinvestment in the US shale patch and the shutting down of a lot of that fracking capacity, then the energy crisis. Now they're sort of re-gearing a lot of that up. And I think we're going to go through some cyclical periodic crises in which you see the price of fossil fuels fluctuate very wildly. But make no mistake, the long-term trajectory is down, on the fossil fuel side.
Dr. Olver, thank you for those points. And I think I need to also go back to a point that you made earlier on, that certainly this does not mean it's the end of coal. It's certainly not the end of coal. I mean, we still have metallurgical or coking coal that is a key ingredient in steel making, as you mentioned before, and steel is really an essential material for modern life. And it's very important that you did mention that it is not the end of coal, but we need to start uh, uh, low emissions at this point right now. It's not really about 2050, but it's about starting as is now. And I think that's very important. Your final words, not only to South African miners, but to general citizens, as a civil servant yourself, what is your final word of encouragement, your call out for citizens of South Africa in terms of climate change and really preserving our environment?
Well, let me say we are a uniquely gifted country in that we've got this incredible set of natural resources, and we built our energy system and our industrial system on one of them, which is coal. But we're equally gifted with renewable resources. We've got some of the best wind and solar in the world. We've got many of the minerals that we need to make the future energy economy work. And South Africa can be a major player in the future. And I know we tend as South Africans to really get wrapped up in a lot of our own problems. And, we have been through a period of declining state capacity, and we've seen a lot of our indicators, poverty, inequality, unemployment, safety and security, all seeming to get worse. I think we can build a powerful, competitive economy that grows employment and gives livelihoods to all of our people. And we've got a unique way of coming together in moments of crisis to come up with the solutions. What's very clear to me is that this climate transition needs all of society to make it happen. There's no ways that government can be the driver of this. I mean, government has an important regulatory role, but this transition needs to be embraced by businesses, by workers, by NGOs and communities, by the science community. We need all of these people playing roles in the thing. And what we're trying to do as the Climate Commission is provide a little bit of a sort of convening space so that these stakeholders can find each other and come together and make this transition a reality.
Absolutely commendable there, Dr. Olver. We have come to the end of our session. Thank you for the valuable insights into the work that you do and the zeal for preserving the environment. Your name will certainly be lauded for generations to come. And we wish you the best of luck at the
Thank you,
at the PCC, and certainly hope that your efforts do come to fruition.
No, great. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to share my views.
Mm. Dr. Crispian Olver, ladies and gentlemen, the Executive Director for the South African Presidential Climate Commission. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, bye bye.